Welcome to The Backstory, a podcast from the North Dakota News Cooperative that takes an in-depth look at the stories we're reporting for you. I'm Sabrina Halverson, CEO of the North Dakota News Cooperative. For this week's episode, I'm talking with Cecile Wehrman, the Executive Director of the North Dakota Newspaper Association, and we're taking a deeper look at a recent report on newspapers around the state. Last time on the Backstory podcast, Michael and I talked about the report that came out, and you were kind of a big part of this with being with the Newspaper Association, and you know so much about local news around North Dakota, especially how our rural newspapers are doing. And it's such an important topic for our communities. And so I thought it would be nice to have you come on this week and talk a little bit more about it. So let's start off with talking about the report that came in. Can you just remind our listeners about the report and some of the things that it said?
Sure. Well, we undertook a year-long study that was made possible by a grant from the Bush Foundation. The North Dakota Association of Rural Electric Cooperatives and the Rural Development Finance Corporation were actually the recipients of the grant. And then they worked hand in hand with us to, survey our members in various ways. We surveyed newspaper executives, so publishers and managers, journalists, the public at large. We did a survey in a news desert areas. There are 3 counties that don't have resident newspapers. And then we also talked to student journalists. And a last component that is still to come in is a study of newspapers that serve tribal populations.
Was there anything in the results that really stood out to you?
Oh, there's so many things that stood out to us. I mean, from the fact that we have the biggest thing overall that came out was the realization that we really are facing a generational shift in ownership. And that's true of so many industries just because of that huge baby boomer generation. So there's a lot of people who have put a lot of years into running community newspapers. And while, we've already seen some of those transitions occur, we know we have more coming. And so a succession planning task force was the top recommendation out of this research, that we want to be providing information to newspaper owners about how to position their business for a sale. And as well, the survey identified that about 25% of the journalists surveyed are interested in becoming newspaper owners. So that's great news. That we have a pool of people. So we'll be doing activities to bring those 2 groups together and hopefully see some successful transitions to keep these incredibly important community institutions alive.
Let's talk a little bit about that, about how important newspapers are to our areas. And it's something that, and just for full transparency for our listeners too, that I'm very connected to because I grew up in a rural newspaper publishing family. My dad had a small newspaper in a very small community. And so I grew up with it, and I know how important that newspaper was to our community. And when I think back about the things through my childhood that were connected to the newspaper, one of the things that happened was the newspaper started this drive to get a library location in our community. And we were pretty far from town. So it was a trek to go to the library. And the newspaper started this petition and it snowballed into this thing. And we eventually got our library branch. And that's just one example of a way that that newspapers can be really important to communities. What are some of the things that you've seen here in North Dakota that really amplify this?
Well, I can only speak from my own experience. I guess I know that the best. But for instance, the newspaper in Crosby, which I still publish, even though I now live in Bismarck, we've helped the local theater become a nonprofit through facilitating making the community aware that it could possibly close, and all the education that needed to happen, fundraising that needed to happen. And that was an effort that happened in 2000, and 26 years later, that's still benefiting the community. That movie theater still shows first-run movies every weekend. And without a local newspaper to marshal the forces and sound the alarm, you wouldn't have seen that happen. And I mean, I could give you example after example of just in my own, hometown community where the newspaper has been integral to helping the city as a whole come together, coalesce around common interests, and make something good happen as a result of that. I often describe newspapers as like the gasoline in the car that is a community. We are the place where business and private citizens intersect. We're the place where citizens learn about what their government is doing. And without that, you just you all you have left literally is Facebook. And we talk to people in these news desert communities, which was really, really interesting to find out that they are primarily relying on Facebook pages to know what their city and county is doing. One man actually commented, I'm not even sure if we have a fire department. There was a lack of recognition of who the local movers and shakers are. Who's the mayor, who's on the county commission, up to, how to vote, where to vote, and what the hours are. It's a lot of work to gather all of the pieces of information the average citizen needs just to navigate daily life. And if you have to go to, 15 Facebook pages to find those answers instead of one newspaper, I mean, that's an incredible amount of time. And it just goes to the value of having people in your town who are dedicated to providing that information to you in one convenient place at, very low cost.
And I think about that too, and thinking about the Facebook situation, which to me, being somebody who really values, truth and accurate information, the idea of having to get all of your information from Facebook is alarming. But
Well, and they talked about that. I mean, and that gets into the trust newspapers have. So
yeah,
these same people, the same group of people in these three counties, their highest trust level for local news is newspapers.
yes,
That's like 80% across the board, on average. And their trust level for social media is 11%.
which is
So
valid, I think.
yeah, I mean, so I think it's a cautionary tale. I mean, we also polled them about, how would they support a new newspaper if it were to come. And so as we go out to communities that where the newspaper is troubled or facing potential closure, we can point to that research and say, you do not want to lose your newspaper. There are a lot of consequences for having that happen. In fact, I'm going to McCluskey this evening because their publisher is elderly. She needs to be done, and she's hoping to get a young person started in taking over that publication. But I need to make sure the community understands that if a newspaper closes, we're not just talking about one business closing. You're not just losing one business. You're losing the intersection of all of this local information and what's going to replace it.
And another thing I think of too is some of the things that some people might think of as smaller. I don't really think they are, but when you think about like your local school sports, or the 4-H club, or whatever, these smaller community groups that are not going to get attention from our larger city news. Fargo, as well as they do produce the news, they can't go out to all of the smaller communities and and get their community news and publish it. Same thing out in Williston or in anywhere, Dickinson, it doesn't matter. But our smaller communities deserve to have their stories covered.
Right.
And having it on social media, that's one thing, great. You can share a site, whatever. But I mean, if you think about it, haven't we all at some point cut out an article that has our kid's picture in it and put it on the refrigerator or sent it to grandma or something? It's not the same when you're just looking at it on a Facebook screen.
Right. Well, we have a program called Read Local that kind of launched in the midst of getting all of this research and wanting to carry forth, the messaging that of all the things that we've learned. And one of the taglines in that is that, read local because Facebook will not archive your town's history and they won't sponsor the local softball team. It's really that simple that people need to realize. I think people treat newspapers almost like a public utility. They feel like it's an entitlement, like it's always going to be there. They can rely on it when they need it. But the fact is, newspapers need you in order to survive. They need the support. And so while, whether you see it every day or every week or not, it's kind of like a I don't know, like a citizen contribution towards keeping your community vital. Because without it, those connections in the community between government and the public and between business and customers, those connections begin to fray, and there's nobody boosting for your town, and the things that connect all of you in ways that are so positive.
Yeah, that's a great that was a great analogy, thinking of it as just a public utility, rather than what a newspaper actually is and how important it. I mean, utilities obviously are important as well, but also if you carry that thought a little bit further, we do also pay for our utilities in one way or another, whether it's directly through our energy bills or through taxes, you know.
Right. And
So
that payment piece is something we're also going to be exploring. So we've got four solutions that are coming out of this research that we're going to pursue immediately, which is the succession planning, a new revenue model for newspapers, which has already been piloted at one North Dakota newspaper, where there's intensive community education about the value of the newspaper and why it needs to cost more than it does currently. And in the pilot that had already been done, they didn't lose hardly any subscribers with a significant increase once people understood all of the value that goes into producing that paper. Another thing that we're going to do is kind of a revenue in a box program where we design a promotion, provide all the graphics, directions for plopping it down in your community and just getting sponsorships to increase revenue, because newspapers newspapers got to have money in order to keep going. And then the fourth one is to do some newspaper sampling. Sampling means printing enough newspapers to cover your entire area and dropping a newspaper in every single box for a period of time, maybe 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and expose non-subscribers to what they're missing. And that's a tried and true method of attracting new interest in newspapers, but it's not something the average small town newspaper knows how to do. It's complicated with the postal regulations and how you have to address them, and it costs money to print 2,000 extra newspapers for 4 weeks. So we're going to provide some help with that. And that's all contingent on getting another grant. And what's nice about each of those strategies is that we will be able to measure the results and prove out to the grantor that look at the impact we had. This newspaper was able to increase its subscription revenue and number of subscribers, and this ad promotion brought them in these additional dollars they wouldn't have otherwise had. And we hope to also be able to provide some actual funding support for newspaper transitions. So for at least one newspaper transition, that we could provide an interest buy down or other help in actually facilitating a sale.
that is really interesting. I really like that idea, and hopefully that grant works. And you also brought up printing costs there. It's printing costs are big for newspapers, and it doesn't matter, like, even if it's a small newspaper, 4 pages, it print paper itself is expensive, and that price keeps going up. Ink is expensive. It is a costly process.
Yes,
I also,
and postage, the postal
yeah.
situation, we've seen now 60% increase in postal costs over the past 4 years, and they don't seem to be anywhere in sight of ending. So, we're having to try different ways of getting delivery to local post offices to save some of that cost and also get the paper out on time. Digital is something that we also have to navigate, because we know that people are accessing news and want to access news digitally. However, the study also showed us that the age group with the highest preference for print, you won't believe this, is Gen Z, 18 to 29-year-old. They
Really?
like paper. They are confronted with screens and spend so much time in these alternate realities. They want something concrete. And so print isn't going to go away. However, we do need to serve people in the digital space. And most newspapers, the majority of our newspapers, have an online edition. They have a website. They're on social media. Some of them even have apps. So, when you hear the word newspaper, I sometimes wish we could come up with a different name for it, because truly we are multimedia, but we're centered around that print product that has been around for hundreds of years.
That does give me so much hope for the future, though, hearing that Gen Z wants printed materials. That makes me feel like, I don't know, that there's hope
That's
there.
why you're starting to see vinyl records make a comeback. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a big interest in those tactile, tangible things that have a physical presence. And in today's world, I think we're starting to see the pendulum swing a little bit. I'm not saying that, oh, we're going to abandon digital. No, not at all. But, even with our Kids Scoop newspaper that we do for 3/4 of the K-6 students in North Dakota, we're demonstrating how kids respond when they have printed material rather than screens to learn on. And there's more and more research all the time about how digital and screens may be impacting how kids learn how to read.
Yeah. That Kids Scoop newspaper, by the way, just fantastic. I love it. For people who maybe their kids are not getting this, is there something they can do so that they can get the Kids Scoop?
Well, they need to help us by suggesting funding sources. So it
Okay.
costs us about $10 a year to provide Kids Scoop for one student, which is really, if you look at that, that's less than a book,
Yeah.
a year. So we in order to break into the markets like Grand Forks and Fargo, we really just need to find some major funders to support that, and then that gives them a Kids Scoop issue every month of the year, and it's full of games and puzzles and just little stories and fun activities that are all aimed at making reading fun.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just such a great publication, and I don't know, just what a great idea. So if somebody wants to say, "Hey, I want to get Kids Scoop to 100 kids this year. Here's a donation," they can send that to the North Dakota Newspaper Association office.
Yes, and our website is ndna.com, and there is right now it's tied to Giving Hearts, but we accept donations at all times. There's a button right there where you can donate to help Kids Scoop, and we recognize all donations above $250 on our donor page. So, yeah, $250 will serve 25 kids for a year. So,
Wonderful. And what a
you're
great cause.
welcome.
Yeah, supporting not only reading and reading comprehension, but also setting the building blocks for media literacy, which is becoming more
Yes.
and more important these
Yeah.
days.
And in fact, we frequently have little activities and stories about fact versus opinion, the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why, in newspapers. And so we're getting a little bit of newspaper language and familiarity with the media at the same time.
Nice. It's wonderful. And for anybody who's listening and has maybe not seen it, I highly encourage you to head to the website and or you also post some stuff on your Facebook page. I have seen some Kid Scoop stuff on there as well, in fact, including an adorable video with one of the young fans of Kid Scoop. So I really recommend that people check it out, especially if you are concerned about the future of newspapers and the future of media literacy, which is a cause that I'm very passionate about too. I feel like media literacy has become so important, and it's really important to start teaching it young so that we have critical thinkers, because
Right.
there's so much misinformation out there. So, well, Cecile, I told you that we'd only be chatting for like 10 minutes. I've kept you for 20, but I really appreciate it. It's a great conversation.
Well, thank you. I love telling the gospel of newspapers because it is just, it's been my life, and it's been something I feel has been very worthy of my time. And I think it's
Yeah.
worthy of everyone's time to support newspapers.
Thank you again to Cecile Wehrman, Executive Director of the North Dakota Newspaper Association. You can find more on that report on our website at newscoopnd.org. For the North Dakota News Cooperative, I'm Sabrina Halverson. This has been The Backstory.